I mean, it's good that Ashwini has laid down the context of what I'm going to present, not as well as he has. So let's say I'm an economist, so I'm going to approach it from a perspective of economics. This is just a simple chart which shows that there are triple crises that the Indian economy has been facing and been facing for quite long. But it is also true that every crisis provides you with an opportunity to fight back. And this is an opportunity which, in the context of which I'm going to present what we think could be done. That requires essentially a change in the model of development itself. Energy transition, changing the demand pattern are all part of that, which is what we are calling the Indian Green Deal. So I'm going to basically make a presentation on that. The structure is why do we need it, next is what, and the last is how, financing the Indian Green Deal. So first is why, which I mean to this audience it doesn't require, so I'll quickly go through the slides, but this is essentially a chart which shows that how much carbon space is left if you look at the two temperatures which are normally discussed, 2 degrees and 1.5, and the dark blue is what we've already used up. This is globally. So you can already see that there is a very small space which is left, but that's not the only problem. The speed with which we are using up the space tells you. So this chart I find quite interesting. What we emitted in about almost 2 centuries, 180 years, we have emitted the same amount in the last 3 decades, just the last 30 years. So that's the speed at which, so I'd say that it's the, it's like you see the iceberg and we are in a Titanic, and in that case you didn't know. But here we know and we are running full steam. That's essentially what we seem to be doing. And the role that India is going to play is quite critical in that context. Climate injustice, there is a very important, both a class angle to it, as so I was saying that everything ultimately boils down to, particularly in the case of climate change, that those who contribute the least are the ones who bear the brunt of it. This is a simple chart. It essentially tells you which region of the world, again something that you already know, the global north emits 4 times as high as their share in the population, and rest of the regions, whether South America, Asia, or Africa, are way, way below that. So the ratios essentially tell you what times of your share in the population. It's like a wine glass. So more it looks like a wine glass, more unequal the emissions are. If you look at it in the context of India, which is, through the NSS data we have created this, that also looks, although this is not the correct picture because the NSS doesn't cover the richest, of course. I mean, they don't, kind of do survey of the Ambanis and the Adanis. So this is more the lower end. So we know that NSS is biased in that sense. But even that actually shows the carbon footprint that different classes have. And if you look at, which we are not showing here, if you look at the effect of this, obviously it's an inverted pyramid. It's the poor who face the brunt of it, of something that they're not contributing to. This I'll skip. So what do we do, since we don't have time? What do we do? And in that, what we are proposing is, let's say we take the amount that the Honorable Prime Minister made a commitment for, the Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is 10% of the GDP. I mean, that number is huge. But let's say that if you were to indeed use it, not in the way that it has been used, because most of it is what we call monetary injection of liquidity. But if you were to use that 10%, then what would it lead to? This is based on, again, the NSS data. If you were to spend this money properly in making that energy transition, then what kind of expenditure you would have to make? So we've split it, just for discussion, split it in 3 parts. One is infrastructure. Again, this is green infrastructure, not the infrastructure that the Amrit Kaal announcement of the last budget was. This is more green. The other is care economy, which addresses the problem that we saw during the COVID crisis. So education and health is there. And one is exclusively on changing the energy transition itself. So that's the expenditure split, 5-3-2%. What does it... So one side is the supply side measure. There are 3 ways in which carbon intensity can be brought down. One is moving towards low carbon emitting fuels. A lot of discussion has already happened on that. The other is increasing the energy usage. I mean, I give always the example of JNU, because I come from a university where we do not have retrofitted windows. वो पुराने लोहे वाले windows अभी भी है JNU में, compared to what you have in IIT Madras. That is where we emit huge, I mean, that's just an example. If you were to make JNU into an institution of this kind, not politically, but otherwise, you would actually be saving a lot of energy. So that's one. The other is investment in greener forms of energy, which Ashwini was talking about. So we are just putting the numbers there for these things. If you were to do it, what I just presented in the last chart, the emissions would go down and go down quite dramatically. I mean, not very dramatically, but it will come down. The last one that I want to draw your attention to. So the IEA step scenario, which is current policy continuing, is going to be, the emissions per capita would be 2.1. And if you were to implement the Indian Green Deal, then it would be 1.4. Now, that seems like a minor, I mean, it's 1/3 a cut in what the emissions would be. Emissions from the demand side, which Ashwini was talking again. So that's why I said it's good context. If you look at it from the demand side, how do we make this transition? One is you change the energy mix itself, but the other is to actually create demand for that, and not just create demand for renewables, but also to move away from the brown sector, so to speak. And economists always come up with a market solution, but in this case it's slightly different, which is that you essentially target through either taxes, you put a tax on the brown sector, so to speak, and or you put a cap, the usual debate between whether it's a quantity restriction or price. So in this case, we are arguing for a carbon tax. Carbon tax, unfortunately, is regressive in nature because it's an indirect tax. So a poor person and a rich person pays the same amount. Even though it controls, let's say, the climate crisis part, it actually reinforces climate injustice. So obviously, we are not of that kind. Coming from the university that I do, that's the last thing I would be recommending. But there is a way in which this can be solved. One of the ways, I mean, the way that we are proposing is that you actually tax or cap, but then you redistribute it in terms of carbon dividends. And I'll present that chart for you, where you tax the revenue that you get. Part of it is used for funding the green energy program, but the rest of it is actually spent in redistributing that dividend across individuals. That can be done in cash or it can be done in kind. The proposal we have is in kind, not in cash. Not that we have anything against cash, but there is a lot of discussion that economists have written about extensively on why cash transfer is not necessarily the best way to share. The way in which, so this is something that can be done at the domestic level, but ideally, the first chart that I had shown to you, the wine glass, essentially tells you that this finance ideally should actually be coming from the global north. They are the ones who have emitted in the past. So in an ideal situation, that is one of the ways in which this can be financed. But if that is not possible, ideal world everybody wants to strive for, but we may not reach there, you still have an elite class within your country which can actually finance this without having to put the burden on the state alone. This is a chart on green jobs. If you were to spend it, what is the kind of jobs you would create? So the NSS data shows, so we have matched the numbers with what the respective sectors would be. How much time do I have?
You still have about 6 minutes.
Okay, cool. I should be done. So this creates about 38.6 million jobs, which is exactly the unemployment rate currently of the economy, particularly during COVID. And the reason why it does that is the following. You look at the brown sector, the fossil fuels, the jobs that every, let's say, 1 million investment that you would make, the number of jobs that it would create, green energy creates 2.5 times more than that. So even in terms of transition, and here we are not even talking about closing down the fossil fuel sector. As Ashwini said, that the rate of growth may either plateau or you don't increase capacity, you shift the new energy that needs to be created towards green energy. Not necessarily, so it's not the situation that the US workers are facing. We are not closing the brown sector down, we are saying don't increase it. Unfortunately, that's not the direction, despite all the commitments to net zero seems to be going. If you look at the gender composition of it, it's bad in general, gender composition of the labor market is bad in India, but relatively speaking, green is better, more gender sensitive than fossil fuels. Rural distribution is more in favor of, and that is because rooftop plays a very important role in this calculation. How do we finance it? That's the elephant in the room, that all this big story that you do this, you create jobs, where is the money going to come from? And that's where the economist in us enters. And one of the ways, which is how India should negotiate, or collectively the global south should negotiate, is that you put a number to the amount which we call the International Carbon Fund, the ICF. You create a fund which essentially is distributed across countries according to the emissions that they've made in the past. So the countries which have emitted more become essentially the global payers to this. I mean, they pay. And those who have emitted less than the average, they are essentially net beneficiaries. Now, this is in terms of flows. That's why you see China as a payer nation rather than a receiver nation. So these numbers essentially are calculated from that. If there are questions, I can take those. But India obviously gains because our average per capita emission is way, way below than, and historically we have not emitted. So thankfully, the amount that I've put here is exactly the amount that you need, not because we fudged the data, but it just so happens to be that number, which is 10% of the GDP, the Atmanirbhar Bharat package. What are the other ways in which it can be done? You can say this is an ideal world, North is not going to pay, I mean, we have been negotiating, they commit, but they don't give anything. So can nothing be done about it? And we would like to argue that you at least start domestically. And the way you can do it, again, there are two forms. You can either do fiscal deficit plus tax, or you actually do it through tax. India currently has zero inheritance tax. In fact, we don't have any inheritance tax at all. The best thing, wealth tax that you have is capital gains tax in the stock market that you put money in. That's about it. These are avenues where you can actually tax the top 1%, as the CFA has been doing on Twitter. The campaign of the CFA is exactly what India should be doing. These are the guys who are responsible for it, and they are the ones who should pay for it. That's one way that you're essentially extracting from those who are contributing the most, at least in the Indian case, and hiding behind the poor. They are the ones who pay for this transition, and a part needs to be carbon tax, and I'll end, I mean, that's the one which I want to spend some time on.
2 more minutes.
Yeah, I'll be done, I think, yes. The last 2 slides are just what we did, just to show off that we did a lot of data crunching. So this is what the carbon tax actually looks like. If you were to implement that carbon tax, look at the, so this blue chart that you see here, oh, no, so whatever. This one, the right side that you see here is essentially the carbon, the tax that we would have to make. Essentially, they would have, so carbon footprint is the dark blue bars that you see there. So the poor have the, have the smallest share in the carbon footprint, but they would actually be paying a higher tax in per capita terms, because obviously, you know, as I said, if you increase the price of a commodity by 1 rupee, whether it's a rich person or a poor person, they pay the same amount. So carbon tax would definitely be regressive, as you can already see. Poor have to shell out more in terms of per capita, I mean, the expenditure versus the rich. Now, this is not something that a progressive person from a university such as mine, which is the, you know, Tukde gang, would actually be arguing for. So what is it that you would want to do in this context? And what you can do, and that's the last slide, what you can do is, as I said, that you tax a part of that revenue you use for the transition that you need, but a part you redistribute. Now, in this particular paper, we have actually shown it as redistribution of electricity. So greener forms of energy, the electricity that it produces, up to a certain limit, like the Delhi government did, that a certain amount, but in the case of Delhi government, it's still brown energy. It's not green, which we are getting for free of charge. But in this case, you're making an underlying transition, and you're providing that, in fact, we were discussing that, that it is, how do you make poor people move away from, let's say, wood towards cleaner forms of energy. If you provide that for free, up to a certain limit, then the transition would be relatively, the possibility of a demand side response may be higher. So if you were to do that, you are actually inverting the whole injustice part that I just showed. The net benefits, so the benefits that you get in terms of, let's say, ration, or in terms of electricity, or in terms of public transport, those are the three components you have there. If you do that, then actually in the net, the poorest would be gaining the most. And the reason is obvious. They are paying something, but the rich are paying a much larger amount. You redistribute it equally, though obviously the poor would actually be getting more than what the rich. And the top 30% of the population loses, which is good for, I mean, that's exactly how the class, funnel should be inverted. This would lead to, again, a large claim, but if you were to have infrastructure, this would give access to electricity. In fact, the government says we already have provided electricity. Every city and village, everything is electrified. Households, including the rich, would move away. Cars would become expensive. Electricity usage would become expensive. In fact, that data is not shown here, but the extent to which the prices would rise, particularly, let's say, for larger cars, so on and so forth, and the taxes would be much higher. But it also has the effect on enticing the poor people to move away from health hazard, let's say using wood or cow dung cakes, because in this case the price of energy, green energy, would actually be zero for them. So in that sense, there is no opportunity cost to move away from browner forms. And dividend also addresses the adverse health impact of outdoor air pollution. All of this is ideal, I know, but our teachers used to say that at least in discussions you present the ideal situation and then let how the politics decide where it goes. Thank you.